At the age of 20, a young lad who was in his final year of the university completing his science degree suddenly felt the call of God in his life to serve the church and the society. He was part of a church youth group who were praying for the revival of the church. The call of God came to him as he was meditating on the Word of God. It was from the passage of Mark chapter 5 verses 1 to 20, where a healed person from evil spirits was getting ready to go with Jesus on his boat, begging that he might be with Jesus all the time. In verse 19 of Mark chapter 5, it is recorded, "But Jesus refused and said to him, 'Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you.'" This verse, where Jesus refuses to take him on his boat and calling him to go to his friends and share the work of God in his life, felt like a tingle on his ears, spoke strongly to this young lad, and ever since then he started to pray about it, realizing that it was the call of God in his life to go out and share the love of God to friends and family. When the young lad informed his decision that he had the call of God and was called into the ministry of God to share the love, everyone, starting from his family to his friends to his teachers to his peers in his college, were all surprised at his decision of going into ministry, as they had high hopes and expectations of him to reach higher, greater heights in the government services for which he always dreamt for. The dad of this young lad played an important role at that time in helping him to understand the call of God and put him through to pursue theology to better understand the relevance of faith in the context of the world. Ever since then, the call of God evolved for this young lad, for the hand of God has been graciously upon him in leading him to cross across the oceans and seas to share the love of God, for God at any point did not give up on him. The young lad grew up with God's grace, served as a minister at the Lutheran Church in his hometown, then went on to serve the National Council of Churches in India and later the Student Christian Movement of India, and currently serves as a minister in the United Stockport Circuit. The recollection of my own call to the fore came as I began to reflect on the call of God that came to young Samuel as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 1 to 20, the prescribed lectionary reading for this Sunday. Those were the days when the word of the Lord was rare and visions were not widespread. The people of God, having settled in the promised land, were without a king and lived as they liked, as recorded in Judges 21:25, with no rule and with no guidance in their lives. Into such a context, the call of God came to young Samuel, who was dedicated by his mother Hannah for the service of God and who was living in the temple with the priest Eli. The call of God tinkled the ears by at least 3 ways. The call of God tingled the ears of the community for choosing a young boy. At a time when the word of the Lord was rare, and if at all the word of the Lord came, it would have come through an experienced person who has known the history and tradition of their faith. Since there was no judge nor a ruler, people have been waiting for some comfort and hope from the voice of the divine. Here was Eli, an experienced priest who was serving all his life in the temple, perhaps waiting to hear the call of God himself so that he can go and share the love of God to all his community around. Defying all the norms and rules, the the call of God came to a young boy Samuel who had no clue what was the call of God like. Imagine when the news went around that the call of God came to a young boy Samuel who has no experience of temple tradition and history, it would have tingled the ears of the people of the community then. However, by choosing a young boy to be the recipient of God's voice and call, the message was clear and loud that God's call comes to people not based on their individual merit or experience, but based on God's graciousness. Right after the judges who demonstrated God's call through their actions of justice, it was a young boy Samuel who heard the call of God, and since he was under God's constant grace, he became a greatest prophet of God and for God in that time and context. God speaks to the inexperienced, the unknown, and the insignificant, and such news comes tingling to the ears of the public sphere. But that's how God works, all surprisingly beyond all known expectations. Now, when I think of my own call, when my family and friends heard about my call, their ears also were tingled, for it came as a surprise. When I informed that I received the call of God and I am going to work for God's kingdom through ministry, it shattered everyone's expectations and everyone were surprised. God surprises and keeps surprising every day through God's call, working beyond all human imaginations and aspirations. Secondly, the call of God tingled the ears of Samuel by repeatedly calling out his name. When God calls repeatedly with love till the point that the listener recognizes it. God called Samuel at least 4 times in this text, and with the help of Eli, Samuel could recognize the call of God. Listening again and again to the call of God, with his name being called Samuel, Samuel, would have tingled the ears of Samuel, and even more so, for he mistook that call to be from Eli rather than from God. We need to recognize the role of Eli in helping Samuel understand the call as the voice of God. Eli had that generous heart in guiding Samuel to recognize that it was God who was calling to him, and he said to him to reply that speak, your servant is listening. In all of this, what we gather is that God doesn't get tired of calling out someone God wishes to speak and calls out repeatedly. Under any circumstance, God wouldn't give up God's call to God's people. No matter how many times it takes, no matter however long it takes, no matter however abstract it becomes, God keeps God's cool in seeing to it that the recipient listens to God's call. God's call comes out of God's generosity, God's love and God's perseverance. And God doesn't give up so easily. God doesn't give up in between. God doesn't give up in any way God is calling. And in this process of God's call, God kept calling Samuel all along. So he was always led by the call of God in his entire life and ministry. As I again remember my own call, I can also vouch that God kept calling, and he has been helping me to know God's call at every point of my life. All I have learned about God's call is that it evolves and unfolds with time, and God does not give up and has never given up in calling God's call to me. God kept calling me, reminding me of the purpose of sharing God's love through the various contexts and situations I have worked. God's call certainly tingles our ears as God repeatedly keeps calling. Thirdly, the call of God tingles the ears with the kind of works God does. When Samuel recognizes it was God who was calling him in verse 11, we see God further saying to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingles." The call of God is not always soothing and pleasant, for it is tingling with matters of justice, and in that context, it was about the house of Eli, whose sons were exploiting the temple for their own selfish needs. The call of God tingles the ears as it comes with voice of justice. The tingling for Samuel further continued when he was called to break the voice of God to straight to Eli the next morning. However, when God calls, God gives the strength to communicate it, and which Samuel experienced it during that time. Since Samuel, without any fear, communicated the message of God, the Lord was with him, and Samuel grew up to become a trustworthy prophet in his land and to his people. In my own call of God, I recognize that God has given me the task of contesting the oppressive structures of status quo, be it caste or colonialism, poverty or hunger, and to engage with the liberation of God time and again. The call of God surely comes with a tingle, and to spread that tingle in speaking truth to the powers. What is the learning of the call of God to Samuel for us today in our context today? Firstly, the call of God to Samuel is an invitation for each of us to introspect our own calling in our lives. God calls each of us differently, and God calls each of us for different purposes. Some are called to be prophets like Samuel, some are called to be ministers, some are called to be doctors, some are called to be teachers, some are called to be engineers, some are called to be business people, some are called to be nurses, some are called to be homemakers, and some are called to be researchers. It is important to recognize that every work to which we are called is a gift of God and is equally ordained by God. In each of our calling, we are called to recognize the hand and the voice of God so that we can exercise our work in love, peace, and justice for the betterment and transformation of our society. Secondly, we learn from this passage, never discount the role of Eli in helping Samuel recognize the call of God. Even today, there are many Elis helping us to recognize the call of God in our lives. So please keep celebrating their role and for the way they are helping us to recognize the voice and the call of God. Thirdly, when God calls, surely the ears and the body tingles. For God calls to share God's justice with some hard messages. In our context today, God is calling us to speak about the free school meals to be given to the children during holidays here in the UK. God is calling us to speak about hearing the voice of God in our communities. God is calling us to ensure that the vaccine should be available and accessible to all people in the world. God is calling us to strive for a just world where love, equality, and justice alone will thrive. And God is calling us to locate and recognize the voice of the divine among the margins of our society. For God is calling us to speak that staying at home, acting responsibly, and caring for one another is the kind of witness that God's looking for from each of us today. Fourthly, the learning for us is to respond to the call of God graciously. When God calls, God also strengthens. Finally, to conclude, Martin Luther opposed the view of a special calling or vocation to the monastic life. He believed that the call of God comes to each of us in our daily tasks. So that for the task we are entrusted with, we are called to recognize that it is God who has called us to it. And so we need to be engaged with the tasks which we are entrusted in honesty and graciousness. May each of us recognize the call of God in our lives and live out our call to the best of our abilities, depending and waiting on the Spirit of God to lead us. When God calls, it tingles. Look out for such tingles. May God grant God strength in the hearing of this word. Amen.